So good morning everyone, and Savadi, and thanks again for SEAC for inviting me to be here, Michelle and both Liz as well for organising. It's great to be back in Sydney. I think I've been here last year, just a year ago, and a warm and wonderful sunny day today. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we are meeting and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I also want to recognise the people where I usually work and live at the Gold Coast, the land of the Yungarrpa and Kambermer people. And it's great to see Laos covered again in Politics in Action after being covered in 2020 the last time, because it's a very small country and most people don't follow it much when we talk about Southeast Asia. So I'm very pleased to be talking about Laos a bit. I will keep it a bit less political than the previous speakers, so I'm going to cover economy, politics and society. And if you have any questions on any particular topic in more detail, I'm more than happy to go into that. But let's start off with the economy. So Laos has a rapid and impressive economic growth in recent decades, but that has been really restrained in the last few years. And growth is estimated to have been barely positive in 2020 and rebounded a little bit more around the 3% mark estimated for 2021, in contrast to almost a 70% growth over the last decade. So a huge drop because of COVID and the impact particularly on the informal economy. In regards to the COVID wave, so Laos in 2020 did actually really well, like most other countries in the Mekong region, but they were really hit hard in the second half of 2021 and also with the current third wave going on. But if you think about the COVID crisis in Laos, it was really much more a crisis of the economy than actually of the health situation. Also keeping in mind that the health system couldn't cope with a large outbreak because the health system being not very much developed in Laos at this stage. And vaccinations have been really supported by international donations, as you can see on one of the pictures here, through COVAX and also Sinovac, so from China. There have been a lot of kind of COVID diplomacy as well in Laos going on, like in many other countries in the region. And by now there are around 4.9 million people, or around 67% of the population fully vaccinated against COVID. But as I mentioned earlier, the healthcare system is quite limited, so any major outbreak would be really difficult to deal with from a health perspective. Australia, for example, has also committed around 15.3 million for COVID-19 vaccine access between 2020 and 2023 for Laos only. So we can also see that the Lao government has been quite supportive through COVAX, and we can see here delivery of, I think it was US through COVAX as well. So there has been a lot of COVID diplomacy going on, and if you think about the last year or two since the last Politics in Action, I think the COVID outbreak and the impact that had on the economy has been quite central. I think the other key aspect when we think about the economy in Laos is the public debt, and that remains really a crucial concern. And that's mainly because Laos has been unable to substantially increase its own revenues, and China has become its biggest creditor by far, which entails both influence in the politics, but also in the economic dependency on China. And I will go through some examples later on as well. And also in recent years, many observers raised the concern on Laos increasing debt to China. So when we think back before the COVID pandemic in around 2019, there were estimates that Laos debt to China was around 45% of the GDP growth. And that would have just increased because of some of the projects I'm going to talk about shortly, but also because main income, the tourism industry in Laos, was hit very hard because there were no international tourists coming to Laos, but also remittances from abroad. Laos has a lot of labor workers that usually work in Thailand, Vietnam and other countries in the region, so they also returned back, and often they brought COVID with them as well. So I think that's the public debt concern is really another major issue when we think about Laos' economy in the last 1 or 2 years. Another thing, and I think closely interlinked, is the opening of the bullet high-speed train. You can see that here on the bottom. So that's actually in Laos. You wouldn't believe it, would you? So that actually opened late last year, just as part of the National Day for Laos. So it was built by a Chinese company, and it was an investment of around 5.9 million. Part of the Build and Road initiative connecting China to Thailand via Laos. And it was developed as a 30-70% joint venture between Laos and the Chinese companies and governments as well. So again, the high-speed train, while it's great for Laos to have a train system they didn't have for a long, long time, again, we can see here clearly the influence of China and the increasing debt through projects like the high-speed train, which has been very popular with the population. There has been uptake. Another area where investment in the economy and the linkage to debt is hydropower development. So at the moment, there are around 15 Chinese-aided hydropower dams operational in Laos. And some of the key projects, for example, include the Nambu 1-7 by Power China, which is on the Nambu River, a main tributary of the Mekong River for people who are not familiar with that. And there's also one planned dam, the Paklai Dam, on the mainstream of the Mekong. So the number of hydropower dams in Laos has been increasing over the last decade, but that hasn't stopped in the last few years. With one of the newest projects in discussion being the Phun Noi Dam, and that's likely to be proposed as part of the formal process of the Mekong River Commission, their prior notification process later this year. So that's another development in regards to hydropower development. And I think closely interlinked when we think about influence and hydropower is when we look at the energy politics in Laos as well. So China's influence was further increased by I think it was March 2021, when actually the Laos State Power Company, Electricity du Lao, or short EDL, and the China Southern Power Grid Company signed a 25-year power grid concession. And that was mainly because the Lao government really, again, had rising debt levels and had an economic downturn due to COVID. So China jumped in and took over a large chunk of EDL, and they created the Electricity du Lao transmission company. And again, that showcases the deepening involvement of China in Laos, especially if we think about energy politics and linking closely to Laos want to become the battery of Asia. And so that's their main strategic focus. And China buying into the electricity grid and having kind of an influence on the electricity exports to neighboring country and in the region really showcases another aspect besides the train and also the increasing debt in general to China, how that impacts the Lao economy in the last 1 or 2 years. And the last point I want to talk about when we talk about the economy is inflation. So inflation really has continued at an average of almost 5% in 2020 and 2021, while incomes really have fallen behind. And also employment rates have dropped, and the informal sector was impacted significantly because of COVID. And another point is the employment rates dropped, and I mentioned earlier migrant workers needed to come back, so often they went back to subsistence farming again. But also it's important and often overlooked is the Lao currency, the Lao kip. You can see on the picture here. It really has reached its lowest value against the US dollar in more than 15 years. And the value of the kip began to plummet in August or mid last year, mainly because of the way the economy was impacted and also COVID-19. And last year it was trading around 9,500 Lao kip for $1 US, and that was the official rate by the Bank of Laos. But the shadow rate or the black market was comparable around 11,000 Lao kip for $1 US. And just comparing that, for example, in 2008, it was around 8,000 Lao kip. So some argue that the Lao kip has been potentially the worst performing currency in Southeast Asia last year in 2021, dropping over 40% in value against the US dollar. And that's particularly important for the population who earns Lao kip, not so much for experts and people who use US dollar. It's beneficial for them. But the local people, again, were impacted because of the deflation of the currency. The Bank of Laos has been trying to stabilize it further, but the black market until recently was actually 13,000 Lao kip to $1 US. So that's kind of when we think about the economy of Laos, there's the kind of three main things, the COVID waves, especially the second wave, kind of late last year, the current third wave in Laos, the public debt, which is really a crucial concern, and then the inflation, as just mentioned. So I'll move on to the politics. And Laos continues to be a one-party state. And one of the key political events I want to talk about, and the key event of 2021 last year, was the 11th Party Congress of the Lao People's Revolutionary Party, or short the LPRP. And that was held in January last year, bringing together over around 750 delegates from all across Laos. And as far as kind of personal and policy decisions are concerned, the Congress mainly pursued the path that was previously defined 5 years ago at the 10th Congress, focusing firstly on a return to socialist ideology and also a firmer grip on civil society in Laos and society in general. But the newly elected General Secretary of the LPRP, Bumyang Volchit, retired from the Politburo, and as part of the Congress they also increased the seats of the Politburo from 11 members to 13 members, and also 9 of the ones stayed on which were elected previously in the 10th Party Congress. And also the Central Committee was slightly increased to 71 people. But I think there are 3 key changes that were visible in the 11th Congress that maybe are worth mentioning. And I think the most significant feature was the very well-known familiar last names coming up in Laos. As you maybe know, there were, for example, 7 children of former presidents or LPRP Secretary Generals of either Khaison Phomiban or Khamthai Sipapong, which are among the new members. So that's around 10% of the entire body, which is kind of linked to very prominent and well-known families within the Lao system as well. And there's also other influential families from both the revolutionary areas, but also the royal areas as well. And also represented in the Central Committee. And I think it's also important to understand that often people from both of the different areas, the revolutionary area, the royals, and also new business partner, they often intermarry as well. So they're creating quite powerful families which are very well known and very influential in both the politics, but increasingly also in the business side of Laos. I think another aspect besides the familiar last names as part of the 11th Congress was also a trend to younger representation in both of the organs, the Politburo and the Central Committee. However, having said that, there's still more than a quarter of the Central Committee members that they're all comrades who took part in the revolution of 1975. One other trend was that the percentage of women has increased, now being around 15% in the Politburo, so still very low, but an additional member, so 2 out of 30 members are now female representatives in Laos. And I think following the party congress, the government also reshuffled the government and the politics, and a few new names appeared. So for example, Thonglun Sisulit stepped down as the Prime Minister to become the President, while Phangkham Viphavon, a member of the Politburo since 2011, was elected as the Prime Minister as well. And I think overall the ruling party reacted to the health crisis by appealing to both morality and unity within Laos, and actually used that as a tool to enhance its own power as well. And it's unlikely actually that the elite will emerge from the COVID-19 crisis stronger as ever, probably even stronger than before as well. And it needs to be seen what the 11th Congress, what are some of the key targets the government is working towards. If it's continuation of moving more towards China, if it's a focus of the Sustainable Development Goals, or what the focus will be over the next 5 years. So it needs a bit more time to see how that's developing. One of the other things in the political spectrum is on the other picture here. That's the new parliament building in Laos, the Lao National Assembly House, and that was actually funded and built by the Vietnamese government for 111 million, again showcasing Vietnam's ongoing interest in Laos as kind of a counterbalance, or trying to keep the interest compared to the large influence of China in the region. And Vietnam is kind of Laos' most trusted friend, with both countries fighting along each other in the Vietnam War and looking back over a 40-year of close political ties, alongside economic and cultural ties as well. And as I mentioned, Vietnam has a high interest and a really growing concern over China's influence in Laos. But again, China has overtaken Vietnam as the largest investor and lender in Laos. Kind of keeping Laos by Vietnam's side is the top foreign policy priority of Hanoi, but it's becoming more and more difficult as well. But this very prestigious building of the National Assembly was kind of one of the signs of last year when it was open to showcase Vietnamese influence in Laos, by the strong influence I mentioned earlier of China. And I think we also need to understand that there's some complicated regional diplomacy in the Mekong region going on, but also influence from external power players that have been increasing, particularly the US. They have increased their investment and presence in the Mekong region through the US partnership, but also then the China rivalry. That really has increased over the last couple of years in the region, but also influenced by Japan and Korea and some of the other traditional actors we know. Laos also joined the newly ratified Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP in short, that entered into force earlier this year. And Laos is also preparing to be the ASEAN chairmanship in 2024. So when we look at the politics of Laos in the last 1 or 2 years, it was really central was the 11th Party Congress, key changes there to have more prominent family names part of that, slightly younger representatives, more women, but again also showcasing Vietnam's influence by the new buildings. And I think that leads me to the third area I wanted to talk about is society. The formal economy of Laos, as I mentioned earlier, is really dominated by large-scale projects that actually generate large amounts of money. They actually employ few people, end up kind of prone to crisis, including electricity, so hydropower, timber, but also, for example, mining. And actually these sectors have had actually quite little impact because of COVID, because of the sectors they're in, having less staff and generating money. But I think where the pressure was felt most was on the ground in the local people, because the small enterprises make up around 95% of the Lao economy. And they often closed because there were no tourism, migrant laborers needed to come back. So again, it's the large contrast between the high-speed train picture you saw and then subsistence farming, which almost half of the population is still doing. And I mentioned the picture on top is Luang Prabang as well, where it was really empty for 2 years, really impacting a World Heritage City, which suddenly didn't have any international tourists, and impacting on the little people on the ground. And apart, as I mentioned, from the farmers, the state employees were all kind of spared from the economic crisis, but then a lot of other people were impacted. I think Laos also decided to try to reach the least developed country status by 2026. Initially that was 2024, but there was a vision because of the COVID impact and the current economic situation. In regards to civil society, the government still continues to have a tight grip on civil society, which became even easier during COVID-19 because people couldn't meet or exchange ideas. And as I mentioned, Laos is a one-party state in which the ruling party dominates all aspects of the politics and harshly restricts any civil liberties. And protests are rare, unlike in other countries in the region, and those deemed to be participating in gatherings can receive lengthy prison sentences, and in general, citizens who criticize the Lao government disappear or are arrested without due process and endure often harsh treatment and lengthy prison terms. And also December last year marked the 9th anniversary since the disappearance of Sambat Sakhon, a very well-known civil society figure in Laos as well. And I think grip on civil society and outspoken citizens were kind of further intensified mid last year as well through a new task force to police social media platform focusing especially on fake news and posts criticizing the government or the party as well. So that was another step to further tighten up the grip. I think to sum up, recent COVID waves alongside the rising public debt and inflation were really the central aspects of the Lao economy in the last 1 or 2 years. In regards to the social rhetoric as well as the leadership, they were really reconfirmed by its National 11th Congress in January, including the selection, as I mentioned, of younger representatives, more female members, and a significant number of members with well-known last names. And I think overall, the social, political, and economic forces seem to complement each other, albeit the impact on the informal economy due to COVID and the tight grip on civil society. And I will leave it there. Look forward to any comments and questions, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you very much. While we're looking for some questions in the audience, can I start by asking you, gave us a great picture of the economic impact of COVID and spoke a little about civil society, but was there any degree of dissatisfaction with the political system because of the economic impact of COVID?
Thanks so much. That's a great question. And I think it's actually the opposite because while people needed to go back to farming, most people, even if they're in the capital, for example, they often have access to farmland or rice fields, or they have extended family networks. So they actually, when they lost their informal jobs, they were actually able to move to farming and subsidize their income, or at least have food security due to that. So unlike in other countries where the economic downturn had an impact on the political leadership, in Laos it seems to me that that was actually not the case, that focusing on morality and unity has actually helped the political elites to be quite successful and overcome. I think now moving forward the focus is on securing the informal economy to get up again. I think that would be very crucial in order to secure the momentum the party has. But unlike in other countries, I feel like there hasn't been much criticism that people have managed in other ways because of the access to land and agriculture, that it was relatively stable, and also the grip on society in general.
Thanks for that, a fascinating insight. Liz?
I have two questions. The first one is quite straightforward. I think you talked about the increase in the number of women in the Politburo, I think. Is that the result of quotas or some kind of concerted effort to increase the role of women, or is that just a coincidence? And the second question that I had is about Chinese investment in Laos, and particularly their investment in dams. With the ongoing tension between China and Vietnam, Vietnamese influence in Laos, how has the Vietnamese government been reacting to Chinese investment in dams, especially considering the environmental implications that they have?
Thanks so much. Two great questions. To go to the first question, I think that the influence of women in parliament in Laos, I think there's firstly the linkage to prominent families and having, the historical relationship of these female leaders who move up the ranks and quite well known. So I think they're clearly tied to the elites, and that's why they get into the position where they are now. And what's really interesting when we look at women leadership within Laos, the Politburo and the highest level is actually often doing better than other countries in the region. But where the problems is within the government positions or at a village level. So it's on the elite level, there's some representation from women, unlike, or higher than in some other countries in Southeast Asia. But the problem is that throughout the board, the numbers are very low. So it might look good at the national level, the top level, but again, throughout the village heads or even within the government position and others, the representation is still very low. And I think most people go into it because of their family ties and background. To your second question, that's a really good point. And I think in the Mekong region, while around 10 years ago, there was quite a lot of outspokenness against mainstream dam by Vietnam and Cambodia, but I think that has really toned down to general comments on dams in general, on the environment. So there's no finger pointing towards Laos shouldn't do any hydropower dams. And I think Vietnam is also in a difficult position because they are at the upstream in a lot of rivers within Vietnam, and they have dammed wherever they could dam as well. So while the environmental impact on the Mekong Delta, salination, rice crop impacts has been really significant, but they have been damming wherever they could go. So it's very hard to have a strong point here.
And I think having that international aspect of this story has been really interesting as well. Any final questions? Okay. If not, thank you. Oh, sorry, yes?
Just very general, how worried should we be about China's increasing influence in Laos for the further region and expansion into the region, or shouldn't we be worried, or what's your take on that?
Yes, thanks for the question. I think if you look at the trends in Cambodia, we have clearly seen that China's influence has been increasing significantly. I think Laos' influence is not as significant yet from China within the country than it is in Cambodia. But I think historically Laos was good in balancing different powers, China, Vietnam. Also Thailand culturally is very close as well, and some other countries. But I feel like this balance in recent years has really shifted more towards China. So while I think there's still some balance with Vietnam still putting a lot of effort in, and also Thailand culturally, I think there has been the trend slowly towards more Chinese influence. And it's very hard with the funding and money available, especially in train, bridges, infrastructure, which is really needed to kind of say no to that. And it's very hard by other players in the region to actually counterbalance that financial support available. So I think the trend has been to more Chinese influence, but it hasn't been as strong as quick as in some of the other countries in the region.